So, Michael, we've known each other a long time, and the first question I want to ask you, which probably no one's asked you for a very long time, you were born in England, and I want to know, but you've lived most of your life in Australia. What percentage English do you still feel?
Oh, I feel 100% English. This is always very annoying, especially, and I don't watch cricket. That's the only sport I ever did watch. But if I were to watch it now, I don't know which side I'm on. I got the side that's winning probably. I used to watch cricket from England when I was a kid, from Australia, and then Australia I'd watch the cricket from England, and it's total confusion there. But it's very much English still.
Yes, it's fascinating, and we will get on to, of course, the very important time you spent in studying in Paris. Do you feel a smidgen French as well, or not at all?
A little bit, yes. I haven't been there for, it's been much too long since I've been to France, but that was a very important part of my life. And I was too young, but imagine the impression it would make going to live in a place like Paris straight from high school. And
yes,
I could have waited a bit longer, really, to get more out of it, but I did get a lot out of it.
Yes, but let's go back. Let's go back right to the beginning. And were your parents musical?
I didn't play any musical instrument, but my father played gramophone records, and so as did my grandfather. So I grew up listening to classical music through LPs, and that really got my interest. I really loved it. It was the gramophone record that definitely got my interest.
And was there a sort of favourite piece from those early years? Is there something you remember? Was it Beethoven's Sixth or something like that?
The piece I remember most of all is the piece that ended up taking me to France, and that's Chopin Les Sylphides for orchestra for ballet, and it has the most beautiful parts for the flute. And so actually, just anticipating a next question from you, but listening to that flute player from a French orchestra, I thought to myself, I'd like to be able to play like that. So it was that recording of Les Sylphides that really got me going. However, I must say before that, I heard a recording of the flute played by an Australian flute player, John Amadio, the famous, way back. He played with the Australian soprano of the day, who would have been Nellie Melba.
That's great.
And he played this little allegretto, which I've subsequently played and recorded, from a suite by Benjamin Goddard. And that really fascinated me, his flute playing that piece. Again, it's a gramophone record, so that's where my interest started.
So can we talk about, this interview is going to go in all directions, and we will get to you, but can we talk about his style of flute playing? Because I know the name, and his brother Clive, it was his brother Clive, wasn't it, who played the clarinet? I met Clive, and he had the sort of bearing of a Hollywood sort of actor. There was something very special about Clive. But what about John? What style of flute playing? How did he?
Dear me, that's a difficult one. I have to be polite here, don't I?
Okay. Oh no, we don't need to even.
No, I'm kidding. It was what we would now call old school, old-fashioned flute playing. But at the time, I didn't know that, and I thought it was lovely. So he would play with barely any vibrato. And what would probably be quite a harsh sound, but it got my attention, and it was, I thought, beautiful playing at the time.
Okay, that's good.
My ideas of flute playing have changed since then.
Yes. So, what age did you start playing the flute? And was the flute the first instrument you played?
I played the recorder in primary school, then the violin, then the viola, and then I got a flute. In England, you do when you finish primary school, an 11 plus exam, which determines what sort of high school you end up in. And my promised reward for doing well was a flute.
Oh, right. So I did well. Sorry, Michael. So the flute was something you desired for a long time then?
Well, a wind instrument. I didn't mind. It could have been a clarinet. I would have been very happy with a clarinet or an oboe, but it turned out to be a flute, what my father bought me. And it wasn't a proper flute. It was a fife. And I was actually bitterly disappointed because it wasn't a proper flute. But I then took it to a school teacher for help in how to play it. He must have seen that I had some sort of talent, and he lent me for 2 years his proper flute. So I owed a great deal to that schoolmaster.
And do you remember what that proper flute was?
The make of it?
Yes. Was it a Gemeinhardt?
It was a riddle card.
Oh, it was a riddle card. Yes.
Yeah. It was a real proper flute.
Yes.
And his father had another flute, a different system, not a complete bowing system. So he said he'd use his father's flute and I could have his bowing flute. So I'm very grateful. I had that flute for 2 years before my grandmother eventually bought me my own flute.
And what was your first flute?
My first own flute was a beautiful thing. It was made of black wood with silver keys. It was a French flute, La Fleur. And I went to bed at night time and I had this sitting by my bedside with the case open so that I could see this beautiful thing as I went to sleep and see this beautiful thing when I woke up in the morning.
Oh, that is such a gorgeous story, and I can totally relate to that. So, did you make rapid progress on the flute?
I did. I made really good progress on the flute because I already played the recorder, and I still suggest to people that's a good way to start any wind instrument is with the recorder. But what then happened was a bit bizarre because I was in a string quartet playing the viola, and I turned up to my string quartet rehearsal and played the viola part on the flute. The right pitch, all the right notes, and I thought that's all that was necessary. I did not understand why they kicked me out of the quartet. And then in the youth orchestra, I was playing viola because there's never enough viola players in an orchestra. So same thing. I ended up in the viola section playing a viola part on the flute. And again, I did not understand, but they kicked me out and put me into the flute section. I wouldn't have got into the flute section as a flute player, but because I was already a member of the orchestra, they said, okay, you go and play with the flutes. So, and then I ditched the viola. I had no talent for the viola.
And in those early stages, you talked about the Goddard, listening to it, but was there a sort of, I often find with students, there's a piece that suddenly really captures them, and then, you know, and I would think for the flute, often it's something like the Chaminade concertina, or was there something that did that for you, or was it just a general?
Yes, I think there was a piece from the La Laisienne Suite, a minuet, I think, that I really loved, and I played that in. The phrase goes along, it starts quite low, goes up to a high G, and I remember the embarrassment in the first performance when I blew a raspberry on the high G instead of a proper G. I was so embarrassed. But you can't do that on a clarinet, I think, but flute players are quite good at that.
Yes. And so did you actually do music exams, or?
I did, yes. I got through the equivalent of AMEB up to grade 8, completely poor at the theory aspect. My father, I remember saying, it is no good, you can't do the theory, you won't be any good at all. But I completely flunked the theory. Later on in Paris, the theory took the form of solfège, which I decided pretty early on, I'm either going to give up the flute and maybe pass the solfège exam, or give up the solfège, and the answer was pretty clear. So if I hadn't left when I did, I would have been kicked out on account of failing solfège. But I still maintain that it's not really necessary to be a good performer. Clearly, yes. Not yes. Vital. It's very annoying.
So if we can jump, you know, to you finished school, and how on earth did you end up in Paris? I mean, because it couldn't have been easy.
Well, it was bizarre. I was in equivalent of year 11. So in the UK system, in year 11, you apply to university. You get offered a place dependent on passing certain examinations in your equivalent of high school certificate. So I went off in year 11. I have to backtrack a bit. Because of the recording I mentioned, Les Sylphides, with the beautiful flute playing, it was the Paris Conservatoire Orchestra. So I sent a letter in English to the Paris Conservatoire asking for a prospectus. 3 months later, I got a reply, said if I send them 3 francs, 3 French francs, then they would send me a prospectus. So I was in year 11. So by the time I worked out how to send them 3 francs, got the prospectus, I discovered I had 1 week in which to present myself for an audition in Paris. And the music was a piece by Botzer, Eugene Botzer, you know how he writes, called Agrestide. And I thought to myself when I saw it, if I could play this piece, I've no need to go anywhere to study the flute. Anyway, I did my best. And my father said, wasting your time. My school principal, headmaster, had a bit of faith in me. And he said, here's money for your fare. Here's some money for a hotel. Take the week off school and practice, and off you go. So I landed in Paris, went to the audition, and as I remember it, there's a great big hall, and in my memory it's full of fog. And at the other end of the hall is a table with a row of examiners, and one of them said to me, I thought, strangest question ever. Are you French or are you a foreigner? I thought, it's a ridiculous question. So I answered it and said, I'm a foreigner. And he said, okay, you can play anything you like. So I didn't have to play the Agrestide. I played a bit of Poulenc. And halfway through, they said, stop. I thought, that's it, failed. So off I went. At the end of the day, I was amazed to see my name among the students that were accepted. And then the next thing that happened was the teacher came down, Gaston Crenel, and he said, let's make a time for your first lesson tomorrow. No, I had to go back to England and do another whole year of school. So off I went back to England, and then my headmaster got me a year's leave of absence. So I did not have to re-audition. I knew I had the place. And then he proceeded to take the person responsible, the lady responsible for giving grants to support tertiary students when you finish high school. He said to her over lunch, if Michael gets a place in London, you'll support him. Why not support him in Paris? And they did. So I had scholarship, I had money from England, and off I went to Paris a year later at the end of year 12.
That's an incredible story. But I mean,
I have to say one more thing. That from being the most unpopular school, the least popular boy in school because I was no good at sport, I suddenly became the most popular boy in the school because the headmaster gave the school a half-day holiday, which was an English tradition when someone's done well. So he was very proud of me. And the school got a half-day holiday, and I suddenly became very popular. It only lasted a day, and I was back to being what I was before.
Michael, that is an incredible story, and I'm so glad we've recorded that because it's just full of extraordinary chain of consequences. So you went off to Paris, and do you remember your first lesson?
I do, but yes, I do. But I also remember my first day. Can I give it to you about the first
yes,
day?
Yeah, please.
When I left home, my father, I have to say, was traumatized by the war. And the whole family, the whole country were traumatized. Anyway, when I left the front door, he said, bye. And he had no idea, and I had no idea where I was going to sleep that night in Paris. No idea at all. I ended up walking around the city with my briefcase and found a cheap hotel. And despite my efforts to find somewhere better, I stayed in that hotel for 6 months. It was actually a blessing in disguise because if I played louder than pianissimo, people would bang on the walls, the floor, the ceiling. And for 6 months, I played pianissimo so softly, whispering, but I always had a good ear for pitch, so it was in tune. And I was so depressed by that, I said to my teacher, I'll come back to the first lesson in a minute. But after 6 months, I said to the teacher, I'm totally depressed, I'm going back to England. And he said to me, he looked at me first and he said, sit down, I'll get you some aspirin and that will fix your headache. But my French was really not very good. So anyway, I ended up staying. But at that point, my father's cousin arrived, who was a professor of French in one of the English universities. He sorted out all my problems. I then had proper university-style accommodation, proper studio in which to practice. It was good from there on, but for the rest of my life, that 6 months of playing softly has really paid off because it's one of the hardest things to do on the flute. And when we finish every note, that's where we go. We go to pianissimo at the end of every note. And on the flute, you know very well, it gets flat.
Yes, that's right.
I had a good ear and I practiced for so long, I could do that without getting flat. I could even get sharp. But it was a really blessing in disguise. Now, my first lesson, I didn't understand much at all, but with learning a musical instrument, it's very much by demonstration. So I understood enough to be able to benefit from that. And then in a class, all our lessons were in a class. So there were 13 or 14 students in the class. Everyone played the same thing every week. So you hear the same thing 13 or 14 times. It's a really good way to learn it. So,
and do you regret that was not the system at the Sydney Conservatorium or other places you've taught at?
Yes, I tried, when I taught at the Sydney Con, I tried to have several students together. For a long time, I had 2 students for 2 hours. So they bounce off each other and work on the same piece. And that worked very well. I had good students as a result, each one trying to be better than the other.
Yes.
But it was in Paris, it was 5 years during which you could remain a student. All 5th year and 1st year students were all in the same class. So the 1st year students had this role model, hearing this better playing, and the higher students had the incentive to be better than the first year students. So everyone benefited from that, and we copied and we listened, we copied, and that's a large part of learning, I think.
And from the teacher's perspective, do you it was much less repetitive then, wasn't it?
But he doesn't have to keep on saying the same thing because he would keep on hearing it. Yes. Yes. Because I had two teachers. I had Grinnell, who was very good at saying, this is how you play the instrument, this is how you play the music. And then I had Rampal, whom everyone's heard of, Jean-Pierre Rampal. And he was a terrible teacher, but he was a role model, and he would say, this is how it goes, copy this. And that's fine. He didn't say how to do it, but he'd say, copy it.
Yes.
And so we learned to play musically from one and technically from the other.
Michael, I remember hearing Rampal in a concert in London, and just when he walked out, I think he was playing one of the Mozart concertos. When he walked out, there was a presence about him straight away. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. He had real charisma. As I say, you just have to walk out, and he's already captivated his audience. He was a great person.
Yes, yes,
and lovely man.
Yes, because that's an intangible sort of concept to understand, but it was just so apparent, yes. As soon as he walked out on the stage at the festival hall, that you just were aware that this was a great man, really, So Paris. Just one last question about your first arrival. Were you overwhelmed by the high standard of flute playing, or
totally? I'd never heard flute playing of that level before. I really don't. I'm not sure how I got in. I'm not sure why they accepted me, but I thought everybody was so much better than I was. Interestingly, in my first year, there was an Irish flute player named Ed Beckett. And in that first year, I thought he was French because he spoke very nice French. In fact, he's the nephew of Samuel Beckett, who lived in Paris. So Ed spoke perfect French. Now, in the later transpired, he thought I was French as well, because I didn't say anything. Anything away. So only in year 2 did we work out that we both had English as our main language. It was a very interesting time, and I was probably too young. I should have completed the course in London first and then gone to Paris, because anyway, it happened. It was good.
Yes, and Michael, if you hadn't gone to Paris, do you reflect sometimes what sort of musician and what sort of player and what sort of teacher you would have been?
Yes, there was an English teacher, Geoffrey Gilbert, and I could have studied with him. He played pretty much in the same style, but I didn't know that at the time. I had not got a proper flute teacher in London. I didn't know how to find one, and as I said, my family were all traumatized. They were not much help at all. And in fact, as a high school kid, I'd walk around the streets looking at people's front door where piano teachers would have a plaque saying piano teacher. So I walked and walked and walked trying to find a plaque that said flute teacher. But if I had stayed in year 12, I had friends in the youth orchestra, and they would have guided me, helped me, and I would have wanted to study with Geoffrey Gilbert. And he taught at the Trinity College.
Right.
Music school, and later when I finished in Paris, I briefly considered studying with him in London, and I played to him, and he very much the same style of playing as the French school, actually.
Right.
Which was quite unusual in London. The British school was much more strident than the French school.
And can we just talk a sort of side issue? You talked about your first Lafleur flute, but how have flutes changed over the years?
Well, they haven't changed that much. People have, the pendulum swings, doesn't it? So wooden flutes went out of favour, and silver flutes became popular, or metal flutes. And now the pendulum swung back the other way, and wooden flutes are now considered to be a thing. They tend to have a more mellow sound. The French have always played metal flutes. Never ever have the French played wooden flutes. But otherwise, the scale, the spacing of the holes has changed. There was an English flute player called flute maker, Albert Cooper, who revised the scale, because Theobald Boehm did massive calculations and worked out the hole, the spacing, and then the pitch changed up to 440, sharper than it used to be. And his calculations didn't work anymore. So Albert Cooper improved it and made it easier to play in tune on a modern flute. And then it hasn't really changed. Pretty much the same. But the materials have changed for the pads. Now they have pads that last a whole lot longer and are easier to fit, because they're quite large flute pads, I think, compared with clarinet pads.
Yes, they are large. Yes.
And getting them to seal nicely is quite difficult to achieve. So that has been a major change. But otherwise, it's pretty much the same as it always was.
And another question before we move back to your life journey. Do you think flutes take on a little bit of the character, whether a flute changes if it's played by a player of a does the instrument change depending on who's playing it?
And the sound changes. And it's very much people say to me sometimes, not meaning to promote myself here, what a nice sound your flute makes. And I say to them, well, there's my flute. I can't hear it. It's not actually making any sound at all.
Yes.
And there's a famous experiment with 5 flutes, all different, 5 professional players, all different, rotate the instruments around the players, and you always pick the player, not the instrument.
Yes.
And one time I played in a school concert at King's School in Parramatta with a wind quintet, and the music master was kind enough to say, your flute sounds lovely. So I'm always offended by that remark. So I said, have you got a school flute I could borrow? And I pretended that mine was not working properly. And he said, yes, of course. So can I use it in the next part of the concert? And he was gracious enough to admit that he could not tell the difference.
Yes.
Now, I could tell the difference. It was mighty hard work playing on that shoddy instrument, but I made it work. And a good instrument makes life so much easier. That's the big thing. It's so much easier to play on a good instrument that would be the same no matter what the instrument was. I make a comparison with a carpenter. He could do a pretty good job with a blunt chisel, but it'd be much easier for him with a sharp chisel.
Yes. Good point. So, Michael, you leave Paris, and what happened before you arrived in Australia, and why Australia?
Well, that's a complicated story, but I met a girl in Paris, and I basically followed her to Australia and got here. She didn't want me. Heartbroken. Not a bad thing for a musician to be heartbroken. And then I did an audition for the ABC, got a job as piccolo player in the Queensland Symphony. Now, it wouldn't happen like that now. I didn't have to play the piccolo in the audition. The panel was one person, one man, Peter Newbury, a cor anglais player, wonderful cor anglais player. He said to me, by the way, can you play the piccolo? Yes, okay. Next thing, I'll get a telegram, principal piccolo, Queensland Symphony Orchestra. So off I trot to Queensland, and I had a lovely time, a lovely orchestra. The further north we went in Queensland, the more friendly the people became. We get on the train each year and go up to Cairns. And I have to tell you this little anecdote. As we got out of Brisbane, the further north we'd go, people had never heard the word symphony. They didn't know it. The closest they could come up with was sympathy.
Yes.
So people would ask, first of all, they didn't know it was a job. So how do you get time off work to come on tour with the sympathy orchestra? It was just quite delightful.
Yes, I hope it's not the same now, but who knows?
I think they've come on a bit in the last how many decades? It was a lifetime ago.
Yes. Actually, Cairns is one of the real hotspots for music in Australia.
Yes.
There's the wonderful music scene there. So the Queensland Symphony Orchestra, and I think the question was, did you have a piccolo? Did you own your own piccolo?
Well, fortunately for me, I borrowed a piccolo. I knew this would potentially be an advantage. So I borrowed a piccolo from a friend of mine in London before I came. He didn't need it. He did eventually want it back, and I had to buy one. But meanwhile, I had a piccolo. Before I went to Brisbane, the ABC were very kind to me. They said, I didn't need a job, didn't have a job. So they stuck me in the Sydney Symphony for 3 months, playing the piccolo. Oh, okay. And the conductor at the time said to me in rehearsal, I've never had to ask a piccolo player to play louder before. Could you please play louder? But during that time, I basically hid and found my feet. So by the time I got to Queensland, I could actually manage the piccolo.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. And from the Queensland Symphony Orchestra?
Then I went to Sydney to play with the Australian Opera Orchestra. Before I have another little anecdote in Brisbane. Before I left there, my teacher Ron Powell came and played a concerto with the Queensland Orchestra, and at the interval, I went to him and congratulated him, bravo, Mr. Ron Powell, and he said, "What are you playing in the next part?" "Well, Tchaikovsky Fourth Symphony," I said. "That has got the most fearsome and terrifying part for piccolo ever written. You sit there through the first two movements and play nothing. Halfway through the third movement, you've got to play this virtuosic thing." So he said to me, "Okay, I'll go and listen." So no pressure. Oh, the first time I was going to play this horrendous piccolo part, and there's my teacher listening in the audience. Never been more frightened. It was okay. I played it because I practiced it, of course. Okay.
How wonderful.
And while I'm on, can I continue at the moment?
Yes, absolutely.
He came to play a Mozart concerto with the Sydney Symphony, and John Hopkins was the conductor. At that time, John was the director of Sydney Conservatorium. Knew I'd been a student, so he said, "Do I have a copy of the cadenzas that Ron Powell would use?" And yes, I did. And I was able to also, when I said, "Here, here, 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 and here, he's going to rush," because Ron Powell was good at rushing. He was not one of these people who were strictly in time. He was always spontaneously, wonderfully musical. And later, John said to me, I was very grateful for that warning about rushing, because he was able to anticipate and keep up with him.
That's fantastic. So, and how did you find life in Sydney?
I liked Sydney. I loved the harbour. But at that time, of course, I joined the Opera Orchestra before the Opera House was open, and we played in Her Majesty's Theatre down in Haymarket for a couple of seasons. And I remember one morning getting a phone call saying, "Don't bother coming to the rehearsal because the theatre just burned down," which it did. We were playing opera The Force of Destiny, Verdi. Years later, the costume wardrobe building burned down, and we were playing The Force of Destiny. And it happened a third time, something burned down, and so they stopped playing that opera. But we played in old-fashioned theatres with a terrible pit for the orchestra for several years before the Opera House, and then we got to the Opera House. And then I loved being right on the harbour. That was a lovely place to work then.
So Michael, did you play for the first concert at the Opera House?
Yes, I did. I was at the opening performance of opera Prokofiev, War and Peace. It was scored for an orchestra of about 100. And they said to us, "No, we can't go in, try it out. We have to wait till the rehearsals about a week before the performance." They discovered we could fit 50 into the orchestra space, not 100. So, and I've never seen a conductor look more stressed, because this performance was broadcast around the world, live, as the opening performance at Sydney Opera House. Yes, that was.
So that must have been an extraordinary night, because even then, I think everyone knew that the Sydney Opera House was going to be one of the world's most iconic buildings, wasn't it?
Yes. Well, iconic. When we walked away from it, we loved it, but we were walking towards it, and with the knowledge that we were going to be squashed up. And under the stage, they based the opera theatre on the Wagner Theatre in Bayreuth, where the orchestra is largely under the stage, which is fine if you're playing Wagner's music. But for a flute player to try and play in unison with a soprano, or not in unison, in parallel with the soprano, you've got to be able to hear each other. And when one of you is under the stage and one of you is on top of the stage, you can't anticipate them breathing or the phrase that you just can't hear each other. So they installed microphones and loudspeakers, but that never really worked very well. And ultimately, that's why I left. So they improved it twice. The second time, it was even worse than the first time. And the first time was even worse than the original. So after that, I couldn't stand it anymore. So when I left there.
And so you left that orchestra, and what was next?
Next, I joined. I took a position at Sydney Conservatorium, which is where you and I met.
Yes.
And part of that job was to play with the wind quintet. The wind quintet was allocated half of the teaching hours, so half my working hours were spent working with the wind quintet, and that was lovely. We had a really good time there for 15 years as a quintet, and teaching as well, of course. And at that time, I also played with Australian Chamber Orchestra, so I had a pretty good life at that time, a very varied musical life.
And until that point, had you done much teaching, or was this the first major
I've been teaching part-time at the Conservatorium for some years before.
Okay.
I remember trying to impose myself on the staff. Again, said, "You need me." I had to learn to be quite out of character and pushy. I'm not naturally like that, but I did, and it succeeded. I was on the staff for a while, and it was Garbo Reeves who wanted me to come. We played quintets that he was testing me to see if I would work, and we got on really well. So that was a happy time.
So if we can go through, there was yourself and Joseph Hannock, who's sadly just recently passed away, and Gabor, who passed away quite a number of years ago. That's on clarinet. Gordon Skinner, who's still playing the bassoon.
Yes, still bubbling away, but very cheerful and happy, it seems.
Yes, and Tony Buddle on
Tony Buddle, yes.
Yeah, and it was it must have been a very special time to have the luxury of rehearsing, and I mean, you were very busy. You toured internationally and all around Australia, so it was an amazing time.
Yes, if you name any town in Australia, I can say we were there. We once went to a town, I think it was Swan Hill in Victoria, with an audience turned up one person. And we thought about it for a while, and we thought, okay, we had a wife was with us. I think Garbo's wife was there, so there were two. So we thought we'd play in the foyer and we treat it as a proper rehearsal. So we played right through. And at the end, the one person said to us, "Would it be okay if I lock up now?" He was actually the caretaker. They'd forgotten, the Music of Viva, who promoted the concert, the tour, had forgotten to advertise the concert.
And in the time with the quintet, were the favourite pieces of the repertoire? I mean, you played a great deal of music, but was there a sort of standout, a few pieces that you just loved?
Well, one was the sextet, the Poulenc sextet with Elizabeth Powell, who we mentioned earlier.
Yes,
that's a lovely piece, so well written, and the French composers actually are very well trained, and they know how to write for our wind instruments. Lots of composers have no idea how to write. I mentioned Prokofiev a moment ago. Got no idea how to write for a flute. But the French composers, so we played Poulenc, and then we had some other French composers which we found were lovely to play. Damase, an unknown composer, Damase, Damase,
yes,
written air and variations for wind quintet, and it's such a lovely piece. We put those onto an LP record, and the ABC would still broadcast that one. And it's a lovely piece, but tongue-in-cheek and the funniest part for the bassoon, but so well written. Yes. So it's one of our favourites. The classical composers are Danzi and Riker, but they wrote classical music in the style of Haydn, Mozart, I suppose, and we like them too.
Yes.
There's quite a good variety. And we would also break down into trios and quartet every now and again.
Yes, yes. And the teaching at the time, it is such a privilege to work at a tertiary institution. Not all tertiary students are quite as good as you hope that they'll be, or to make the most of the situation. But the ones who do, to play a part in their career, are there any particular students who stand out in your mind as being?
Yes. Well, my best student, I think, of all time was a Spanish. Well, he was a high school lad when I first met him at the Conservatorium High School. And they invited me to hear his audition because he couldn't speak English, and they didn't really know what to make of him. So when I heard him, I said, "Well, this boy is brilliant. You've got to take him in." And I taught him right through the high school and through the Conservatorium. And when he got to the Conservatorium, he was playing. Well, one of my teaching methods is to insist on a new study every week, a new one. No matter how well or how badly you play a new one next week. This way you learn to sight read. So by the time he was in his final year at the Conservatorium, he was playing 6 pages virtuosic studies that I couldn't play. And one day he left his study book in my studio, and I thought he'd come back tomorrow and get it, but he did not. He came back on the morning of his next lesson and said, "Did I leave my study book here?" "Yes, here you are." He came back 3 hours later and proceeded to play the next 6-page virtuosic study just perfectly. He became principal flute with the Spanish National Orchestra and professor at the Conservatorium in Madrid. So he was probably my best ever student, and he was just wonderful, musical, talented, virtuosic player.
Yes.
So
yes.
yes.
And
Others, sorry, I interrupted you, were about to say something. I learned from one student whom I thought is never going to be able to play musically, someone learning at the university actually, and doing music at the university and academic degree, but doing flute performance with me at the Conservatorium. I would have to show her how to phrase and how to be musical. And I thought, if only I could pass her on to one of the other flute teachers, I would, but she did everything I asked her to. So I had no excuse to pass her on. But one day she played something to me which I had not shown her, and she made it sound beautiful. And she proceeded later to get herself a job in one of the professional orchestras in Australia. I proved that you just cannot pass judgment at an early stage.
I think what you just said is so true. You know, it's when you've been teaching a very long time, like both of us have, you lose the confidence to make those predictions, don't you? You know, because it's sort of, it's sometimes for some people it takes a very long time for suddenly everything to come together, and sometimes for people who find it very easy early on, it doesn't mean enough to them, and it's they move on to something else because. Yes, it doesn't.
What about Harry Kirby? Did you know Harry? He was a violinist.
Yes.
He said to me one day that the students come in two types. Either they've got talent and they're lazy, or they work hard and they've got no talent. They said every once in a while you get one student who's got the talent and he works hard. And he said you wait till no one's looking, you get down in the corner, put your hands up and say thank you.
Yes. I think that's absolutely true. And over the years, how is your teaching style? Has it stayed much the same, or has it sort of developed? Do you use any sort of new techniques with your teaching that?
Yeah, I think it's changed a lot. Again, experience. When you start off, I'd hate to think what I was like as a teacher at the beginning. No experience really, and we're not taught. And I wasn't taught to be a teacher. So I think conveniently for me, I had to struggle to be a flute player. So I had to work at these things so I could pass that on to my students. And this is where Rampal was not very good as a teacher, because he did not have to struggle. He was so gifted. He didn't really have to think about things. And I have to think about everything. As a teacher, I always feel the need to explain how and why do we do it like this. And keeping in mind, Yehudi Menuhin, great violinist, whom I had the pleasure to work with later on. But as a young man, he was a brilliant violinist, and his teacher said to him, "You're not doing that correctly with your bow, but it works for you, so leave it." So he continued to play with a bad technique, and then later on, it failed, and he didn't know how to fix it. So I'm making sure that my students know how to fix it if it goes wrong. This is how we do it. We learn from first principles. Even if you can already do it, we're going right back to first principles and learn how to do it properly, so that in the future, if it goes wrong, you can fix it.
Now, one of the things that has fascinated you for a long time, you mentioned in passing, when you were first in Paris, you had a good ear. And so can we talk briefly about your thoughts on intonation and because this is something that you're very passionate about?
Yes, it is. That's probably the thing I'm most passionate about. Now, I didn't know I had a good ear when I was a student. Later on, I realized that this is how I was able to manage playing so softly and do it well. But playing opera, opera was a great experience, I think, for me, certainly. We played an opera by Wagner. I'd have to say the conductor at the time, no, I'm going to jump over. A later conductor said of Wagner, the moments of beauty and hours of agony. And I think that's the case with Wagner. Anyway, in the agony department, we're playing Tannhauser. And there's a prelude for woodwind with just sustained chords, nothing happening on the stage, or maybe a scenery change or something, just long chords. And it was so out of tune. We didn't know how to fix it. And the conductor, he didn't know how to fix it. He kept looking at us and saying, fix it. We couldn't fix it because we didn't know how. And it was so embarrassing and so out of tune. Sustained chords. So anyway, later on in life, quite a lot later, I worked out what we should have known at the time, how to play in tune. And I make sure now that all my students know how and why to play in tune. And when I was at the conservatorium, I got all woodwind students to spend time with me in groups of 3 or 4, learning to play chord progressions in tune. And then I understood also that equal temperament, which is how the piano is tuned, people think it's equally in tune in every key. Well, it's the opposite. It's equally out of tune in every key. We can't play wind instruments in equal temperament. We have to modify the pitch, sometimes much more than we expect, and much more than is comfortable in order to be in tune. And it's quite clear once we get it in tune that that's how it should be. And I'm convinced that in the biblical times, well, maybe not biblical times, ancient times, when the organ played in the church fell down, the wall crumbled, and it was because of the out of tune but power of the instrument that was playing. Those organs, when they're out of tune, they're deadly vibration. So it's painful for wind players to be out of tune, but most people don't know what to do about it. On the flute, the C sharp is the most obvious note. It's so sharp, so out of tune, but we can fix it. We can get it in tune. But because flute players are so familiar with the characteristic sound of an out of tune C sharp, they accept it. And you can listen to recordings. I hear recordings of orchestras. There's a lovely flute player, and there's a sharp C sharp, and it should never happen. Never been pointed out to them.
I think we had a conversation one time about a recording of the Reinecke flute concerto about out of tune C sharps at the start. Oh. Yes, yeah, it's true. As wind players, we get used to the characteristics of the instrument, and it's the longer I play and continue to practice, I realise that the tuning is actually always the most difficult thing to come to terms with.
Yes. And so, Matt, can I add to that my other interest in vibrato? If we're going to play in tune with those instruments that use vibrato, we need to match the vibrato with each other. And when I played in the quintet with Joseph and Gordon, all 3 of us using vibrato, people would say to us how lucky we were, that our sounds blended so well. Well, actually, it's not that. This is really hard work and good management. We make sure we have the identical vibrato. And in a flute section, I would always want my second flute player to be able to match my vibrato, and we would change it depending on the character of the music. And for most people, I'm going to say many, but I believe most, are unable to change their vibrato. And then singers, playing with opera, I learned to match my vibrato with that of the singer. I once nearly got my head knocked off because I always would tell the singers this is what I'm doing, soprano, and one of them thought I was being offensive in describing what she did as vibrato. Many singers don't acknowledge vibrato, they would call it quality. So when I accused her of vibrato, she saw it as an accusation and she thought I was being really rude. But I do believe that we need to learn to control it and not just let it happen. It mustn't happen unless we tell it to. And they go together with intonation, because the two go together.
So, Michael, with such finely tuned ears, it must be difficult for you to enjoy listening to music, or it's that.
I had when I was young, I wished to have a good ear, and now I have a good ear, and it's not a blessing at all. It's a real affliction. I can't hear any. I mean, first of all, if people ask me to dinner and what would I like for background music, well, I say there is no such thing as background music. If you want to talk to me, no music, otherwise my ear will just home in on the music.
Yes.
So in shopping centres, it's just a nightmare. I hate that, especially you go into a shopping mall and you hear music from this shop, you hear music from that shop, and the all at the same time. How do people cope with that? I can't cope with that at all.
Yes. So is there any music that you can listen to in the privacy of your own home that you...
Yes, I love listening to recordings at home now. I can't play anymore. I have to say I miss it terribly. But yes, I listen to recordings, and the recordings are generally good.
Yes, and what sort of music? And what sort of music do you like listening to, Michael?
That's an interesting question. I had quite wide taste. I like Mozart, particularly Mozart. I like Mahler, Stravinsky. when I'm asked what's my favourite piece of music, I learned from a cellist, Rostropovich, in interviews. What's your favourite piece of music, Mr. Rostropovich? I regularly quote this: the piece that I'm playing right now. That's my favourite piece. But listening to music, I like Mozart. And as for playing Mozart, I'm getting off your subject every time here, sorry. But when I'm playing Mozart, I love playing the piano concertos, because the flute part in the piano concertos are divine. They are to die for. Yes. And I've had good fortune to play with the Australian Chamber Orchestra many times in the International Piano Competition, where all the finalists had to play a Mozart piano concerto. Heaven, absolute heaven for me. I tell people now, I would, only slight exaggeration, I would kill to be able to do it again. And the ultimate Mozart experience was playing with Yehudi Menuhin when his sister Hepzibah was playing Mozart piano concertos with the Australian Chamber Orchestra. And there was one in the flute part, an ornament, just a simple turn, but a progression of turns. And I couldn't play it. It was so fast, I couldn't play it. And I was so embarrassed. And I went to the conductor, Yehudi, and said, I can't play it. And he did the same thing. He says, it's okay, no one can play it. He's pointing to, he says, it's too fast. And it was very fast. But otherwise, well, that gives you, my very favourite would be Mozart, then playing Mozart piano concertos. I have recordings by all the pianists I can think of, recordings of Mozart piano concertos. I love them probably more than anything else.
Yes, I love the Mozart piano concertos too. So, so Michael, you just touched on the subject that you've stopped playing, but I remember recently, I mean, comparatively recently, you did maybe it was your last concert with Sumiko in the Blue Mountains.
That's right.
And by all accounts, it was a fabulous concert. But that is when you decided to stop playing, was it?
I listened to the recording of it, and I thought it's just not good enough. But people did say that they liked it. Well, to keep up that standard means a lot of practice. And no, I didn't think the standard was good enough. I didn't think I played. Oh, that's the thing. I heard it and I thought I was out of tune, and I thought I didn't notice it. Excuse me. During the performance, I did not notice that I was out of tune. I thought that's a good time to stop before it gets embarrassing. Yes. So, and also the fact that to continue playing, I would have to do so much practice, and it's painful, especially at this stage in life. I get back pain when I play the flute now, and no one's paying me anymore. So for pleasure, people say, don't you play for fun? And my answer to that is, well, what fun in playing badly? No fun at all.
Yes, but you still do a very long day's teaching on a Saturday.
Yes. And I like that, and I can play brilliantly for 2 minutes to demonstrate something. 2 minutes is good. Longer than that, I try and avoid going for any longer. It's here. The lips don't have the muscle tone anymore.
Yes.
Sure, I could get it back, but I don't want to now.
No. Well, that's fair enough. But it is a privilege, as we get older, that we can still work and relate to young people as well.
Yes, it is. Yes. And I think they help keep us young too, thinking young, working with young people, and their enthusiasm is what keeps us going, probably.
Yes, that's good. And I think we should also just mention your wonderful daughter, who is doing such amazing things in the music world, isn't she?
Yes, I'm proud of her, and both of my kids. My son is a recording engineer, sound engineer. He would call himself. He was recently called to record the London Symphony Orchestra when they were here. He was their technician of choice to record it. But Liz has done very well. When I see her conducting, in my head, she's 2 years old. I see her on the podium at the Opera House with a choir and an orchestra, and she's just 2 years old. She made the most wonderful question. When she was 2 years old, she would sit in lessons and sit in the corner, quiet as a mouse. And after one lesson, we were talking about cross fingerings. She said, "Daddy, why was that fingering cross?" I've quoted that so many times.
Yes, I'm sure. Yes, Michael, it's been a real pleasure capturing your story, and thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Mark. Thank you for taking the trouble, and it's lovely to have a chat with you. So thank you.